Alright, so time for just a quick recap. Remember in the previous videos, we introduced a couple of very important cryptography related concepts, starting with hashing functions. Remember, hashing functions are those functions that receive any kind of input and they always produce a fixed length output. And whenever we change one bit in that input, we always get a completely different output. That way we can use hashing functions to provide integrity for data, to detect whether somebody has tampered with that data in the meantime. We also talked about another category of functions, and those are encryption functions. Remember, we talked about two different types of algorithms here. We talked about symmetric encryption algorithms, which use the same key for both the encryption operation and the decryption operation. And we said that we have a couple of problems now because we need to figure out a way to communicate in a secure manner or over another secure channel that encryption key. We also lose any kind of visibility as to who is using that key. So we don't have any kind of identity information connected to it because everybody is using the same key. All right. And the most complicated part in encryption, we also talked about the public key cryptography, or about asymmetric encryption. That's the encryption type where we use two different keys. We have a private key, which is never supposed to leave your possession, and we have a public key, which can be freely distributed to anyone, even over the internet. It doesn't need a secure channel. You can just send it over email, you can post it in a website, you can just package it in a certificate and have it freely distributed to anyone who wants to communicate with you. Now, these two keys are used together always. Whatever one key encrypts, only the other key can decrypt. So that way we simplify the problem of key distribution, right? We can give the public key to anyone, and when they want to communicate something to us, when they want to send us secure encrypted information, all they need to do is just take that public key, which everybody can have, use it to encrypt the information, and only us, because we are the only ones that own the private key, only us can decrypt that information. So we get much better security when it comes to actually allowing other entities to send us encrypted information. Now, all this sounds okay, I hope it makes sense, but it's still just a theoretical aspect of cryptography. We need a practical implementation. We need to use it in our day-to-day work, in our daily interaction with websites, with VPNs, with digitally signed files and emails. All right, so let's talk about the actual use cases from real life where we can apply the concepts that we just talked about. So let's go back just one step and remember what we just said a couple of seconds ago about public key cryptography. Remember that we are the only ones that own a specific private key, which means that that certain private key can be used to uniquely identify us as a person, as an identity, which kind of makes sense now if you think about it. This would be one way for us to actually add some sort of a signature or digital signature to documents or to data that we send, that we generate, that uniquely identifies us. And this allows any recipient of that data, anyone who we send that data to uniquely identify us as being the senders of that data. So we're closely getting to the realm of authentication here, because a recipient now over the internet can look at a piece of data and determine, well, this piece of data has been encrypted by Andrew, because Andrew is the only one who owns that private key that was used to encrypt that piece of data. Now, there's also a big limitation regarding public key cryptography. Remember which one that was? It's the limitation of the fact that you can only encrypt as much data as the length of the key. So if you're using 2048-bit keys, 4096-bit keys, that's all the amount of data that you can encrypt. So you're not going to be able to encrypt all the VPN traffic. You're not going to be able to encrypt even an entire email message. So what can we encrypt actually to help us get this benefit of uniquely identifying a piece of data simply by, modifying it just a bit, tampering with it just a bit, but still by using that private key, because that private key uniquely identifies us. Which leads us to the discussion about digital signatures. And basically, a digital signature becomes a combination between a hash of the original message and an encryption performed by our private key of that hashed result. Now we know that hashes are always limited and they're small in size. They're just a couple of hundreds of bytes in size, which is more than enough for us to be able to use that private key to encrypt that hashed result. We might send a 10 megabyte email, we can hash it down to 128 bits of data, and then we can encrypt that hash with our private key. And guess what? The result of that encrypted hash becomes what we today refer to as a digital signature. All right, so let's see how this actually works. All right, let's pretend that we have the well-known situation where Alice, on the left-hand side, wants to send a message to Bob on the right-hand side. All right, then they have a communication channel right here in the middle, probably not secure. We don't care about that one. Now, what Alex is going to do from the very beginning is that she is going to prepare a clear text message. We're going to call this M, capital M. Now, what Alice is going to do next is that she's going to take the contents of this clear text message and is going to enter it into a hashing function. And we'll call the result of this the hash of message M. All right, so we started with the clear text message. Now we also have the hash of that clear text message. Now there's one more step here performed by Alice, and that is she takes now the hash of this clear text message and encrypts it with her own private key, resulting in an encrypted hash. So the result of this is going to be an encrypted version with the private key of that hash of that original message. Now this result right here at the bottom, this is what becomes now a digital signature. So all that Alice now needs to do is to take this resulting piece of data and attach it to the original message, which in turn becomes a digitally signed message. Now this exact very same message gets delivered now to Bob, which is going to receive the same document, but this time with that little encryption part attached to it, with the little digital signature. Now what's Bob going to do? Well, Bob has to validate this digital signature. Remember, we're not replacing the entire message, we're just attaching a digital signature to it. So the original clear text message is still there. Right? It's the exact same one that we started with. So Bob takes the original clear text message. He can read that message, but wants to authenticate it, wants to be sure that it actually came from Alice. So looks at this little digital signature right here, this red square attached to the original message. And the first thing Bob does is perform the process in reverse. That is, he's going to decrypt that hashed message that he just received using Alice's public key this time. And he's using Alice's public key because Alice's public key is the only key that can decrypt whatever was encrypted with Alice's private key here on the left. What Bob gets after this successful operation is the original hash of the message that was generated by Alice. So now Bob can look at this hash right here and compare it with his own calculation of the hash that he can perform by himself from that original message that he received from Alice. Now, if these two hashes match, so if the received hash equals the calculated hash, Bob can be sure that the message integrity is okay. So the message hasn't been modified in transit. And there's also one more thing that this process tells to Bob. The fact that he has been able to use Alice's public key to successfully decrypt that message confirms the fact that the message has been authenticated as actually coming from Alice. So we get two things here. We get message integrity. We know that nobody has tampered with the message in transit. We know that's the original message that we're looking at. And we also know that the message was actually sent by Alice because nobody else could have encrypted that message in such a way so that we could decrypt it with Alice's public key. That's how digital signatures work. So we're coming back here to our slide. We basically now can tell for sure that a digital signature provides us with integrity because we have the hashing process. If those hashes match, the hash that we receive along with the message, and the hash that we can calculate by ourselves from the message that we're receiving, if those two match, then we know that the message is the original one. We also get authentication, because this asymmetric encryption process ensures us that nobody else apart from Alice could have encrypted that hashed message, right? So if we are able to decrypt it with Alice's public key, then 100% sure, mathematically proven, that message could only have been encrypted using Alice's private key. And finally, we also get an additional bonus called non-repudiation. It's an interesting one. You know what? we know for sure that Alice is the only one who sent that message, but what if Alice denies having sent that message? Maybe it's an illegal act, right? Maybe it's a cyber attack that is digitally signed by Alice, and we can trace it back to Alice. Now, Alice cannot even deny having sent that message because Alice is the only person in the world that owns that private key, which is a very important concept that ties this authentication process to accountability. We can actually trace actions now back to human identities by using this public key cryptography implementation based on digital signatures. The long story short, all the story about digital signatures is basically just a method to encrypt a hash of an original message. That's it. There's an encrypted hash. Another very important use case in cryptography is called a digital envelope. Did you just see a problem with the process that we described before using digital signatures? I've said it several times. We're not encrypting the entire message. We're just encrypting the hash of the original message. So the original message remains in clear text, which means that we don't get any kind of confidentiality when using digital signatures. That's all it is. If you think about it, an official document, it has your signature on it. It doesn't make that document unusable, unreadable. It's just a way to authenticate that document, but it's still in clear text for anybody else to see and read and use. All right, so we don't get confidentiality. But of course, there are methods, I'm going to talk about them right now, in which we can use the concepts that we already know about, such as symmetric encryption and asymmetric encryption, to provide confidentiality as well. So how exactly does a digital envelope work? Well, we'll start with the same Alice and Bob, and the same insecure communication medium that we might have between these two. The first thing Alice does is that she is going to obtain from Bob a copy of Bob's public key. And we're going to call this one bpubk. Now, of course, Alice has its document ready, the file that he needs to send, in clear text. What she does, she takes that clear text document and encrypts it with a symmetric key. So we're using the type of key that we can use for both encryption and decryption. We're going to call this one SYMK, right? This is the symmetric key randomly chosen by Alice. Next, what Alice does is that she is going to encrypt the symmetric key using Bob's public key, which results in something that we're going to call an encrypted symmetrical key. So we're not encrypting hashes anymore, we're actually encrypting encryption keys. Now what Alice does next is that she sends both the encrypted message, this one right here, and the encrypted symmetric key to Bob. Now when Bob receives this type of information, he's going to take the encrypted symmetric key and decrypt it with his own private key. Remember, because it was encrypted from the very beginning with his own public key by Alice. So Bob in return obtains a clear text symmetric encryption key, which then in turn can be used to decrypt the original message. Because remember, the original message was actually encrypted with the symmetric key chosen by Alice. So after this operation, of course, Bob obtains the original clear text message. So what we're doing here is actually we're encrypting the original message using a randomly chosen symmetric key, and then we're protecting that symmetric key using public key cryptography. Because an encryption key, again, is a pretty small set of data, just a number of bytes, hundreds, maybe thousands of bytes, but more than enough so we can just encrypt it and protect it using public key cryptography. So with digital envelopes, we get the benefit of confidentiality because we're protecting the entire message with a symmetric key, which then in turn can be protected by public key cryptography. Symmetric encryption keys are not going to be very long. Probably just some tens, hundreds, even a couple of thousands bytes in length, more than enough so that we can protect it with public key cryptography. Now, unfortunately, we're losing something here. We're kind of losing authentication because as opposed to digital signatures where we actually encrypt with the private key and then anyone can decrypt with our public key in order to validate our identity, well, right here, we're actually encrypting with the recipient's public key so that we can be sure that only the recipient can access the information by decrypting it with its private key. But we're losing this authentication part, because anybody can theoretically generate that digital envelope. Anybody can use that recipient's public key. So we don't have out-of-the-box authentication. We can have, but we need to combine the concepts from digital signatures with the concepts from digital envelopes in order to provide both confidentiality and authentication to our messages. So we can use that digital envelopes now to solve the problem of communicating the encrypted message along with the encryption key. Because that's the main problem, right? We're using an encrypted message because we don't trust the communication medium. We think that it might be intercepted or sniffed. So how can we send the decryption key along with the message? Because the decryption key could also be intercepted as well. Well, a digital envelope solves this problem because it relies on public-private key infrastructure. And in real life, this type of negotiation that we just talked about happens as a process called key exchange. Whenever you're negotiating the encryption keys that you will be using in order to communicate with a secure website, or the keys that you'll be using to transfer data over a VPN, you're going to go through a process kind of like this one that we just described right here. Of course, this all happens transparently in the background while the connection is being set up. So in both examples so far, we're relying on some sort of a public key being communicated to the second party. So we need a public key to validate a digital signature. We also need the recipient's public key in order to send them a digital envelope. So how do we communicate this public key actually in real life? Well, in real life, we're packaging these public keys in something called a digital certificate. Now, a digital certificate basically becomes just a recipient, a container, a wrapper, if you wish, for a public key, along with some additional information, of course. But the public key is the main information that we're interested in, along with the fields that uniquely identify the name of the person or the domain of the website that we're trying to communicate with or validate its identity. So we could say that a digital certificate is basically a piece of digital information that we can associate with a real-life identity. So this certificate right here, I can say that it's a reflection of a real person in the real life, right? We can use it to uniquely identify someone, just like you use, for example, a government issued ID or a driver's license in real life to uniquely identify and authenticate a person. Now we have a problem here as well. And so we talked about these public keys that were given to anyone, and that we use digital certificates to wrap these public keys and then send those digital certificates actually. There's still a big problem right here. The problem that anybody can generate a public-private key pair, anybody can generate a digital certificate, anybody can share that digital certificate with anyone, and they could write anything in it. They could impersonate someone else. They could impersonate a different person, right? They could be sending emails digitally signed with a fake identity. So how does this actually help us? I mean, we do have the technology out there, but apparently we cannot rely on it. And the same problem goes in real life. Now, imagine if I were to authenticate myself to you, and you ask me for a proof that I am actually Andrew, that my name is actually Andrew. And let's pretend that I just use a napkin and write on that napkin, my name is Andrew, and I just show it to you. Are you going to trust me more now that I actually generated a document that says that I'm Andrew? Are you going to trust me even 1% more? Probably not even 1%, right? So what do we do in real life in situations such as these? We're not going to accept a napkin, of course, but we are going to accept a government-issued ID. We're going to accept a passport. We're going to accept a driver's license. Why do we accept those and not a napkin? Well, because those documents are methods of identifying ourselves as a certain person, but they're also trusted. You trust the entity that generates government-issued IDs. You trust the entity that generates passports. You trust the entity that generates driver's licenses. And you know that those documents are very difficult, next to impossible, to be forged. So that's exactly the concept that we're going to apply to digital certificates as well, because anybody can generate a digital certificate. So how do we actually trust the owner of digital certificate that they are the person that the digital certificate states that they are? How do we do this? Well, we get a third party, we get a higher authority to digitally sign those digital certificates, and put their own signature in there. And if everybody trusts that higher authority, when they say that they vouch for me for being Andrew, well, if everybody trusts it, then everybody is going to believe it, that, okay, if I can show you a document, even if it's a napkin, that is actually signed by some high-level authority that everybody trusts, if that napkin says that I'm Andrew, then I am really Andrew. Everybody's going to believe this. And in digital certificates world and in the public key infrastructure world, actually, we call this higher level entity a certification authority, or a CA. And of course, in order for this to work, everybody must trust the CA. Everybody must trust that whatever the CA signs is valid. So the CA must have some verification methods. Not everybody can just go to a CA and ask them to generate a certificate that says that they're Bill Gates, right? It shouldn't be possible. So if the CA put their signature on a document, on a digital certificate saying that I am Andrew, they probably made some checks in order to prove that I'm actually Andrew. So whenever you see a document signed by that CA, you're going to trust it. Now, how do we know which CAs to trust? Well, most operating systems, and especially most browsers out there, come prepackaged with a list of trusted CAs from all over the world. Those are the CAs that have been known to provide a good reputation, good service. They haven't been breached, or at least not as far as we know, so that whatever they are generating as a digital signature for our certificates, it's going to be valid and it's going to be trusted. Let me show a list of such approved CAs. Now, I could take Firefox, you could take any browser you want, and you can head over to the settings section. I'm going to search here for Search Certificates, and I have a button here that says View Certificates. Now, if you click on this one right here, you're going to find the last tab here on the upper right-hand corner called Authorities, which is basically certificate authorities. And there's a huge list in here. These are all valid, well-known, and built-in certificate authorities that your browser is going to automatically trust. So if your browser finds that a website is signed by the Amazon root CA number 1 right here, then it's going to trust it automatically. You're probably going to recognize a couple of these, such as CertSign, DigiCert, Intrust, Global Sign, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a lot of certification authorities in here. And in most cases, VeriSign as well. In most cases, if you just visit a website such as, I don't know, google.com. All right, so let's head over to google.com. All right, now if I click on this lock sign right here, says connection is secure, verified by Google Trust Services LLC. I can click on more information, drag this window right here and cite, and under the security section, I can view the certificate for this specific website, right? You can see it's a certificate that applies to all the subdomains inside Google. So it's star.google.com. You can see it's issued by Google Trust Services LLC, which is officially called GTS CA1C3. All right, so this is the certificate authority right here. All right, you can also click on this one and see the actual certificate of the certification authority. All right, certification authority, yes, it is. What else we have in here? There's the public key information. The algorithm is RSA 2048 bits as the key right here. Also has a serial number, uniquely identified. You can also download the certificate in PEM format. This is a printable ASCII type format for digital certificates. There's the fingerprint, the SHA-256 or the SHA-1 hashes of the public key. And you can see that the key usages right here says that this certificate can be used for digital signature, certificate signing, and CRL signing. I'm going to talk about this one later on. All right. So coming back here to the certificate of google.com, you can see that we also have some subject alternative names. So it's the same certificate that gets applied to all of these alternate domains inside Google. So covering a lot of countries, covering a lot of Google services in here. The algorithm that is being used, it's an elliptic curve algorithm with a key size of 256. That's the key right here. Again, we have a serial number, a signature algorithm. We can also download the certificate and so on and so forth. Now, of course, if we really want to try and check this, we could be looking at this GTS CA1C3. So if you go back here to the certificate section, you should be able to find GTS. There it is, Google Trust Services, GTS CA1C3. right? And this is why when you visit Google, you don't get a warning saying that you're not going to trust that certificate, that a certificate there's a mismatch, or is it expired, or it is not signed by a well-known authority. That's because the Google certificate is actually signed by this CA right here, and this CA is built into Firefox, right? So it's a well-known, trusted CA. Same goes with any site out there. Go ahead, try a couple of well-known sites, see what their CAs are, see who signed their certificates, and see why are you automatically trusting the communication with those websites. Now, there's also an interesting concept here called perfect forward secrecy. If you just look at this term, it doesn't tell you anything, right? It kind of suggests something about encryption, but pretty much that's it. Now, perfect forward secrecy addresses a problem that we just covered when we talked about digital envelopes. We said that in order to encrypt the bulk of the data that we're about to send, we need to generate a symmetric key, one symmetric key, all right? And that symmetric key, then we're going to protect it using the public key infrastructure that we're relying upon, right? The public-private key pair. Now, the problem is that, in theory at least, if at some point that entire communication session gets recorded by somebody who is snooping on the traffic, somebody who is intercepting that traffic, and then at some point in the future, the private key of the server you're communicating with, or the private key of the recipient you're communicating with, gets compromised, well, all that communication could be potentially decrypted, the symmetric keys would be shown, would be revealed, and the entire content of the communication could be decrypted, and thus we would lose confidentiality. So perfect forward secrecy is just a way to mitigate this problem by generating what is called an ephemeral or a session key or a temporal key that is being used for a limited amount of time or a limited amount of data while communicating with that specific destination. And what's even more important is that these ephemeral keys are not being protected now by the server's private key. So in case the server's private key is compromised, we're not going to be automatically risk revealing those symmetric keys that we use. No, there's a mathematical set of operations that is being performed known as a key exchange with an implementation called the Diffie-Hellman algorithm. Now, Diffie-Hellman algorithm is basically an algorithm that you don't really have to know the bits and pieces of it in order to understand how it works, but it's an algorithm that relies on an exchange of messages over an unsecured channel that helps Alice and Bob reach the same conclusion, reach the same agreed upon symmetric key without actually exchanging that symmetric key over the unsecured medium. Now, there's a very good picture here that I like to show. It's actually available from Wikipedia that depicts in a graphical manner how Diffie-Hellman actually works. So if you head over to the Wikipedia page of Diffie-Hellman key exchange, if you scroll down right here, you're going to see this picture. And I like this picture here because it doesn't rely on any mathematical concepts in order for you to be able to understand it. So we have Alice and Bob, all right? How do Alice and Bob can agree upon a common secret over an unsecured channel right here in the middle without actually communicating that secret ever over the unsecured channel, right? How do I tell you something without actually telling you that thing, right? And the way it works, it's something like this. They agree first and they freely communicate over the unsecured channel a common starting point, such as a common color, such as yellow right here, right? Then they each generate their own secret colors without communicating them over the unsecured medium. In case of Alice, Alice generates an orange, Bob generates teal, I think this one is, right? And then Alice combines these two, combines the common paint with the secret paint, and results in some light orange or something like that. Bob, on the other hand, combines yellow with teal and results in some light blue color. What they do is now they exchange these colors over the unsecured medium, over the public transport medium, right? They just change it. And then each of them recombines the other one's result with their own secret color. So Alice uses the light blue color from Bob and combines it with her own orange. Bob uses the light orange from Alice and combines it with his own teal. At the end, we get the same brownish color right here, which is the common secret, without ever actually communicating this brownish color over the unsecured medium. Also, in the unsecured medium, we need to assume that this mixture separation is expensive. That is, it's next to impossible or to computationally impossible or unfeasible to determine from which colors did these light blue or light yellows, light orange colors actually came from. So this is one way of showing how Diffie-Hellman works. Now, if we had someone intercepting this communication in the middle, they would see the common paint. They would see the combined colors in here that were being sent. They would never see the common secret. The resulting value that both Alice and Bob finally get to, and this common secret from now on can be used to actually protect as an encryption key the data that we're about to send. And we both know it, so it can be used as a symmetric key. Now, PFS can also be implemented using Diffie-Hellman in this ephemeral mode that we just talked about before, in which we're not deriving those keys from the private key, we're just deriving it from this dynamic key exchange, and periodically change that key over a certain number of bytes. After a certain number of bytes have been sent through that channel, we refresh the key, or after a number of minutes or seconds have lapsed, we are regenerating the key again, just in case the key gets compromised at some point. Now, whenever Diffie-Hellman is combined with this ephemeral algorithms, we get something such as Diffie-Hellman ephemeral, or ephemeral Diffie-Hellman, or elliptic curve based Diffie-Hellman ephemeral, and so on. Basically, if you find yourself in the exam having to identify Diffie-Hellman implementations that use perfect forward secrecy, look for something with Diffie-Hellman and E in the name. DH, or EDH something. That's going to be what you're looking for. Those are the implementations that use perfect forward secrecy. Now, the encryption algorithms also have some modes of operation, that is in their real-life implementation. And first, we have the so-called unauthenticated or non-authenticated modes of operation, that is performing encryption without actually authenticating the source of that data. These two modes are the ones that we actually we touched upon in the previous video: cipher block chaining mode and counter mode. When we talked about cipher block chaining before, I'm going to go back to this Wikipedia page right here called Block Cipher Modes of Operation. If we jump down to cipher block chaining in the middle, you're probably going to recognize this picture right here, right? Where we just split our encrypted data into a number of fixed blocks. We combine these blocks with the first one with an initialization vector, right? Then we use the encryption key, and then we get the result under a ciphertext. Then we reuse this ciphertext as an input for the next block. Again, we combine it with the encryption key. Again, we get a ciphertext, and so on and so forth. So this is cipher block chaining. We're encrypting each block individually, but we are reusing encrypted material from the previous block, so that no two inputs, no two blocks, even if they are identical, are never going to produce the same exact encrypted result, which helps us defeat cryptanalysis attempts. The second one here is counter mode, which is kind of similar to what we just talked about. And counter mode, also known as integer counter mode, is basically also a type of block cipher, but it generates the next key stream block by encrypting successive values of a so-called counter. So instead of reusing encryption material from the previous block, we are encrypting the original clear text along with a counter value. You can see here for the first block it's going to be all zeros, for the second one it's going to be all zeros and 1, all zeros and 2, and so on and so forth. Again, in an attempt to generate different inputs even for completely identical blocks, so that we can get different encrypted outputs. Now, these two modes of operation that we just talked about, they're considered to be unauthenticated because there's no identity information related to the encryption operation. And also, theoretically, a person could potentially perform some cryptanalysis on this text and introduce their own values in there, maybe insert additional encrypted data if they know how the encryption mechanism works, and we would not be able to detect this. Now, one method of providing authentication in the encryption process is by implementing something called a message authentication code, or a MAC. Don't confuse this with the layer 2 MAC in network packets. It has nothing to do with that. So MAC stands for message authentication code, and it kind of looks like this. So basically, we're taking the message or the encrypted message, passing it through a MAC algorithm, where the MAC algorithm does pretty much what a hashing function does, except that this time the hashing is performed not just on the original message, but on the original message plus a secret key. All right, so we get that end result called a MAC, that message authentication code. We attach that MAC to the message, we send it to the destination, and then the destination, after decrypting the message and after analyzing the MAC tag that is attached to the message, they can determine when they recalculate that hash along with the known secret key that they're supposed to know already, whether the hashes match or not. Now, if those hashes match, we can now know for sure that the message hasn't been tampered with in transit, because in order to tamper with the message, you would not only have to intercept it, modify it, and then recalculate its hash, you would also have to know the secret key that was used in order to calculate that resulting hash, because the secret key is never communicated with the rest of the data. If previously we thought about hashing functions as being sufficient for just validating the integrity of the data, now we think about the situation where what if somebody intercepted that message in transit, made some changes in that message, and then nicely recalculated the hash value, because the hash is based on some well-known algorithm. Anybody could recalculate it and reattach it to that message. The hash would still be valid, but it would not prove the integrity of the message. Well, in this case, with the message authentication code, this situation is not so easily reproducible anymore, because if somebody intercepts that message and they try to make some changes in it and recalculate the hash of that message, well, those hashes are not going to match anymore, because they are not going to be able to generate a valid hash without knowing the secret key that goes in that calculation as well. Now, in real life, you're going to find algorithms that implement this type of MAC under the names of AES-CBC, for example, for cyberblock chaining, or AgeMac SHA, right? The hashing algorithm with an hash-based message authentication code attached to it. So it's more than just a hash, it's a hash of the data plus a secret key. And unfortunately, and this is something you should know for the exam, some of these implementations are vulnerable to something called a padding oracle attack. Check out this link right here for more information about this type of an attack. And finally, we have some more exotic modes, also based on this authenticated encryption or MAC implementation, called authenticated encryption with additional data. What kind of additional data? Well, we usually use this additional data from the actual data header or the actual data communication session in order to generate some messages or some communication encrypted packets that are unique to that specific communication session. Why are we doing this? Well, to avoid replay attacks. Replay attacks are the attacks in which an attacker intercepts a specific communication, even if it's encrypted, and then replays it back, resends those same packets at a later time. Now, if we don't have some way of identifying which packets belong to which session, anytime an attacker would replay, for example, let's say an authentication session captured from a legitimate user, they would be authenticated even if they don't even know what the user's credentials are. They're simply sending the same encrypted data as they've seen that user doing. So authentication encryption with additional data allows us to add more information to the encryption and hashing process so as to make these replay attacks impossible. So now let's go back to the main topic of the training, right? Talking about security controls. How can we implement the encryption, the hashing methods that we talked about, the implementation methods that we just covered in real life in actual controls? Or where actually can we use these concepts to better increase the security of our network? So coming back to the idea behind public key cryptography, when we said that a private key must only belong to a single person, that basically means that we can tie that person's identity to something that has been done using that private key, like a digital signature. So we can use the concepts that we just talked about, hashing functions, encryption functions, to uniquely identify a person, which leads us to an implementation of these concepts in authentication systems, where we need to prove that a single person has actually proven their identity and has a way of proving their identity in order for them to gain access, for example, in an application or in a network. And using private keys that can uniquely identify a person becomes the basis of an access control system. As a consequence to this, we also get non-repudiation. If a certain message has been encrypted in a certain way that we know for sure that can be done only by a specific private key, then the owner of that private key cannot deny ever having done that operation, ever having sent that message, ever having signed that message, ever having generated that encrypted content. So that's non-repudiation. Your inability to deny having done an action because you are the only owner of the key that can do that action. We can use cryptography for, well, encryption, of course, right? That's one of the first use cases. But in general, we're going to be using something called hybrid encryption. Hybrid encryption means that we're combining symmetric encryption with a symmetric key that we're using to encrypt a bulk of data with asymmetric encryption, in which we're just protecting that symmetric encryption key. Because remember, we cannot use asymmetric encryption to encrypt huge amounts of data. And also because symmetric encryption is much faster. So it's more resource efficient to use a symmetric key to encrypt a large amount of data, such as network traffic or files on a disk or an entire disk even, and then protect that symmetric key using asymmetric cryptography. So in order to encrypt files, such as BitLocker, for example, the way BitLocker works, well, in case of BitLocker, the user is being generated a public and a private key pair. Now, the private key pair is stored somewhere in a secure area of the computer, such as a TPM chip, that only becomes available to the user when they are authenticated to the domain or to the machine that they're using. Then the public key is being used to generate a random symmetric key. And that random symmetric key is actually used to encrypt the data on the disk. Now, when somebody needs access to the data on the disk, they can use the private key stored in the TPM, of course, after they've properly authenticated, to decrypt that symmetric key, and then use that symmetric key to decrypt the actual files on the disk. The same goes even with websites. When you're visiting a website over HTTPS, what you're doing, the first thing your browser does is download the public certificate from that website that you're accessing. That certificate includes a public key, and that public key now can be used to communicate with the server, right? Whatever you're encrypting with the server's public key can only be decrypted by the server, which owns the private key. And then you can use this communication channel to further negotiate a symmetric key that can be used to encrypt the actual traffic that you're about to send and download or upload to and from that website. Of course, we can also use cryptography to ensure integrity of data at rest or at data in transit, to make sure that those messages, that data hasn't been tampered with. Just like we said before, we can combine that hashing operation with a secret key that can prevent a man-in-the-middle attack, intercepting that message, making some changes, and then repackaging it down to its final destination. It's not possible anymore with a message authentication code because the hash is being calculated from the message as well as a secret key. Finally, there's the idea of obfuscation. Now, obfuscation can mean a lot of things, but in general, it means that it's an attempt to make something difficult to read. Not impossible, just difficult to read and to interpret. For example, you might have heard about obfuscation regarding source code. Now, an obfuscated source code makes it impossible or really difficult for somebody who tries to reverse engineer a piece of software down to its original source code, and makes it really hard to understand by humans. Of course, machines won't have any problem with that code because the code is still functional, but it's just really hard to read and to follow by human eyes. Now, with cryptography, we could think about trying to implement something close to obfuscation because we're basically scrambling data. Right? We make it difficult to read. Now, unfortunately, the way encryption scrambles data also makes that data unusable even by computers. Because regardless of how much you encrypt your data, whenever you're storing it, whenever you're transferring it, whenever you're using that data, at some point, at least for a couple of milliseconds right there, while you are actually processing that data, you need to decrypt it. Computers cannot work with encrypted data. They have to, at least at the CPU level, inside of their memory, inside of the actual process that uses that data, it has to be decrypted before it can be used. So protecting application code or source code this way doesn't really work. Think about it, because if you provide encrypted code for your CPU to execute, first of all, it's not going to be able to do it, right? So you need to provide the decryption key as well. Well, how do you provide the decryption key along with the code, along with the executable code, in such a way so that an attacker or somebody who wants to take advantage or crack the protection of that software is not going to be able to find that decryption key? It's impossible to hide something inside of a computer, right? This even starts to get closer to that concept of security through obscurity. So you simply cannot protect data by bundling it with the decryption key as well, right? It makes no sense. This is also sometimes called box cryptography, because in the same box you get the encrypted data and also the decryption key. And more or less, this is how DRM kind of works, digital rights management. And we all know that all the methods that rely on DRM for protecting video content, music, games, software, apps, and so on and so forth, that pretty much all of them have been cracked for this specific reason. Now, when talking about cryptography, performance is also an important topic, simply because it requires additional effort. And sometimes we don't have the necessary resources to perform that additional effort. You might be trying to perform cryptographic functions on a smartwatch, on a mobile device, on a smart doorbell, on an IP camera, for example. You probably don't have that many resources available, so you're gonna have to make some compromises. You might be forced to use lower complexity encryption algorithms, or use shorter keys that don't take that much time, that much computational effort to process. And also try to keep in mind that in general, symmetric encryption is much, much faster than asymmetric encryption. Then we also have the problem of latency, especially in interactive applications or authentication systems. Sometimes we are bound by time, by the execution time, to finish all our cryptographic processes in a predefined amount of time. Most likely because if that cryptographic process is involved in an authentication system, nothing can be performed. The entire system is non-functional unless the authentication system agrees that the person has been authenticated and authorized to perform those operations. Or no data can be transferred over a VPN, or no communication can be performed with a secure website unless the cryptographic part finishes in a predefined amount of time. Key size in general, as long as we talk about the same algorithm, means a more secure encryption method. So the same algorithm with a shorter key is theoretically easier to break. Same algorithm with a longer key is going to be more difficult to break, but of course it's going to take more resources as well. Now, don't compare key lengths between different algorithms. It doesn't have any kind of relevance. I mean, I think I've covered this one before, but for example, in elliptic curve cryptography, a 256 bits of a key length provides pretty much the same security as a 2048 bit key length in an RSA key pair. Overhead, not just from a resource consumption perspective, but this is extremely important, especially for small battery-powered devices or very limited devices, but also because these cryptographic operations have to be dynamically on the fly executed and inserted before each and every access to that data. Every time you access a file on an encrypted disk, you have to go transparently through the decryption process in order to be able to access that data. So more operations are required whenever you're accessing protected data. And a lot of problems occur whenever you're working with low power devices, IoT devices, battery power devices, devices that only have a very limited CPU power, that cannot implement, or takes too long, or it consumes too much power to implement mature and strong encryption algorithms. Entropy is a measure of disorder, how much disorder we have in our data, which means that a clear text document, an unencrypted document, should have low entropy. On the other hand, an encrypted document should have high entropy. So there should be a lot of disorder in there, so that there's no way we could just look at an encrypted file and see, well, this piece right here kind of looks like the header in an email message or the signature in an email message. Now, we shouldn't be able to do this. Right? There shouldn't be anything that closely resembles or remotely resembles something from the original text. And this is relevant because in some situations, even though the mathematics behind the encryption algorithm is sound, is okay, is proven to be okay and reliable, the actual implementation in programming code of that algorithm might have some flaws. For example, in the way that program actually generates those random numbers, those random symmetric keys, for example, that we just talked about, that we're using to encrypt the bulk of the data. Now, if that random number generator doesn't exhibit enough entropy, we face the risk that by performing cryptanalysis on the way that algorithm works, to be able to determine what the next random number is going to be, which would be very, very bad and could open us to a huge security risk. Also on the topic of keys in general, because the keys are the actual random material that gets generated, there are specific keys that in specific implementations of specific algorithms generate low entropy. So certain keys that when used to encrypt data, they don't encrypt it that well. right? It still retains some of the characteristics of the original text. Now, in most algorithms out there, the implementations should take into account these exceptions. So there are some known keys that generate low entropy. And whenever the algorithm generates a random key, if it happens to generate one of these low entropy keys, it should ignore it and generate another one. And this is actually one of the reasons why the implementation of the algorithm itself is one of the important factors that comes into play when evaluating the performance and the level of security offered by an encryption method. So some ways to fight against these problems related to predictable numbers or predictable random numbers, have a couple of them right here. The first one is by using so-called nonces, number used only once. That's a nonce. So whenever we need to generate some unique material, we can concatenate that unique material with a randomly generated number called a nonce, which can also be a counter, for example, just like the one that we saw in use in blockchaining. It doesn't necessarily have to be random, it just has to be unique and never reused. We also see initialization vectors, again, sets of data that are randomly generated, supposedly not to be reused anymore, that make that initial exchange or the initial encryption that is based on those initialization vectors unique. Finally, we also have salting. Salting is a technique that can be used along with hashing, and it's especially used with hashing passwords. Whenever you're storing passwords for an authentication system, for a website, for an application, if you're storing user profiles, you should never store the user passwords as well. Instead, you should be storing a hash of that user's password. And now whenever the user presents his or her authentication credentials, you take the user's password, you hash it, and then you compare it with the hash that you have in your own database. If the hashes match, well, the user is good to go. It's authenticated. Now, why are we doing this? Well, because whenever we are storing the passwords in clear text or even in encrypted format, we risk them being compromised as a result of a data breach. But on the other hand, if we just store the hashes, well, if we happen to be facing a data breach, we'll be losing those hashes. Those hashes will become public, but as you know, there's no way to reverse engineer a hash to figure out what the original password was. Unfortunately, there is a way of doing this, but not by reverse engineering the hashes. Instead, there's a concept called a rainbow table. Rainbow table is a pre-calculated table of hash values of all possible inputs that can generate those hash values. So for example, I can just take all the letters of the alphabet, all the numbers, all the punctuation signs, and start from all the combination of 1 character, 2 characters, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on and so forth. And I start generating all those combinations and calculate the hashes of all those combinations. Now it's going to result in a huge table. Of course, it's probably going to be tens or hundreds of gigabytes in size, but guess what? Now, if I happen to get my hands on a hash database, on a compromised web server, or a compromised application authentication system, I can just search for that hash in my rainbow table and see what password was used to generate it. And the advantage of doing this is a linear search in a huge database. It's much faster than trying to generate all those hashes until I finally find the one that actually matches the one that's in my database. So I just calculate them once or download those tables, because there are public rainbow tables as well, and even paid rainbow tables if you wish. And then I can just search the hash value in that rainbow table to find which password was used to generate it. So apparently storing the hash values of the passwords isn't so secure either. This is where salting comes into place. Salting means that we are now not just calculating the hash from the password, but we're calculating the hash from the password and a small string of bytes that we add before or right after that password. And then we calculate the hash. What does this do? Well, this invalidates my rainbow table, because my rainbow table was calculated for clear passwords, not for passwords plus a hash. Now, whenever I provide a password to that authentication system, the authentication system gets my password, concatenates the small salt, and then calculates the hash, and then compares it with the one in its own database. Now, the interesting thing is that that salt doesn't even have to be secret. It can just be a small string of bytes that can be stored right next to the user profile. I mean, I don't even have to secure it. Everybody can know it, but it's going to invalidate all the possible rainbow tables that have been pre-computed to use just the password, not the salt. So that's one way of enhancing authentication systems by salting password. And that's actually the way passwords are currently stored on Linux systems. Want to see how this looks like on a Linux system? Well, you probably know that by listing the etc password file in a Linux system, I'm going to see the list of users, what shells they're currently using, the groups that they belong to, their user IDs, and so on and so forth. Now, this Andrei user right here, that's the username, should be followed by the password, but the password is just an X in here. You can see all of them have X's in here because the passwords are not being stored in /etc password, have them being stored for some time. Where they are actually stored are under etc shadow. And I'm gonna have to sudo this. And there you have it. This is my username right here. This one right here is the field that stores the information related to my password. Now, this first section here between these two $signs, this indicates the hashing algorithm of my password. And then the next section down to the next $sign, this one right here is the salt. You can see the salt is stored in clear text. What's next? That's the actual hash. So right now, if I were to search for this hash in a rainbow table, I would probably find some sort of input that generates this hash, but that input is not going to be the valid password for my account, because whenever I provide that input as a password, that input is going to be concatenated with this salt value, and the end result is going to be a completely different hash. So this is how you store username and password information on Linux systems. Now, some of the risks that we're facing with encryption and some of the things that we should keep an eye out whenever we're choosing an algorithm or a key for encryption are just a number of ideas here listed on the slides. First one being the age of the encryption algorithm. How old is the actual encryption algorithm? It might be that it used to be a valid algorithm like 20 years ago, but in the meantime, weaknesses have been discovered, the computational power has increased, which has made any attempt at cryptanalysis, at breaking that algorithm, much more possible nowadays than they were 20 years ago. So choosing an up-to-date algorithm, one that is okay for the current year that we're in and the corresponding key length, that's an important decision. A lot of the algorithms that have been discovered over time nowadays have been deprecated, which means that you shouldn't use them. It's not that they are gone. Of course, the algorithms are still there, but sometimes people use them simply because they don't know these are old and vulnerable algorithms. So not all encryption is equal. You also have to take into account the age of the actual encrypted data, or how long should we keep that data encrypted? Because the longer we keep it encrypted, the longer we risk that encryption method to be broken. Because things are evolving every single day. CPUs are becoming more and more powerful, better at cryptanalysis. Weaknesses are being found in encryption algorithms every day as well. Well, maybe not every day, but every year perhaps, right? So how long we store that data is going to affect how secure that data is going to be after, let's say, 20 years from now in the future. So talking about risks that we're facing, or that our encrypted data is facing, we can think about, first of all, man-in-the-middle attacks. Now, man-in-the-middle attack, as a general concept, relies on the fact that there's a third party, an attacker, that intercepts the communication between Alice and Bob, for example, and then they either just inspect it, so they gain access to confidential information, or they alter it, so they change the integrity of that data. And a special category of man-in-the-middle attacks are those that address that negotiation part of keys before the actual transfer of encrypted information. That negotiation part has to be done over an unsecure medium. So it's very important, what exactly do Alice and Bob exchange over the public internet or over an unsecure network before they actually agree upon an encryption method, an encryption key, an encryption algorithm, and they start sending data. Because in some implementations, if an attacker is able to intercept that communication, then they can pose themselves as either Alice or Bob, or even reuse some of the keys that were negotiated in that process. For example, when we talked about digital certificates or digital envelopes, we're relying on the fact that either Alice or Bob have to communicate their public keys to the other party. Well, what if the attacker intercepts that public key and injects their own public key in there from the very beginning? You have no idea that it happened. And you start negotiating and start talking, and you start negotiating keys and establishing session keys and perfect forward secrets and everything else, but you're doing it with the wrong person. You're not doing it with Bob, you're doing it with the attacker. And you're negotiating a secure channel with the attacker simply because you've accepted from the very beginning a public key that did not come from Bob, but came from the attacker. So we can mitigate this using certificates. You can mitigate it using signed certificates, valid certificates, and the entire public key infrastructure concept that we talked about. A downgrade attack is another type of attack that is actually very smart. You have this negotiation phase whenever you're connecting to an HTTPS website. You're negotiating with that website something like, well, this is the list of algorithms and the key lengths that I know how to use. Give me your list so we can match it, right? We can find some common ground and then use the best algorithm in that list. Well, of course, an attacker could pose as somebody who doesn't know all the high-end algorithms and key lengths and only presents the weakest possible encryption algorithms out there, saying, well, that's all I know. I'm sorry, that's all I can use if you want to talk to me. Well, if a badly configured web server is in place, they might be open to accept all the possible encryption algorithms. Maybe there's no security analyst in there that decided at some point, well, we shouldn't be accepting these because they're too old, they have been deprecated, and whoever installed the web server just enabled everything. Now, that's a downgrade attack because you're downgrading the quality and the correctness of the encryption algorithm down to something that is easily broken or completely unsafe nowadays. The key stretching is another method of fighting attacks against cracking passwords, for example, or guessing passwords or encryption keys. Because in many situations, the key provided as a password by a user, for example, whenever they authenticate and they want to gain access to some BitLocker protected disk. Well, they're going to enter their username and the password, and maybe they have something like the password of 12345. Well, it would be a bad idea to use password 12345 to encrypt the entire disk. So we're not using the actual password from the user. We're taking that password and we're passing it through a number of transformation operations so that we're making it longer and more complex. We're repeating it a number of times. We're hashing it. We're mixing the characters around. We're replacing characters. We're basically doing some sort of a low-end encryption on it just to obtain some sort of a cryptographic material that is valid to be used as an actual key, not just 12345. That's key stretching. And key salting, what we just talked about. Well, we're combining the key, the password, with an additional salt, with just a sequence of characters that makes the hash generated by that password unique and thus cannot be defeated by the use of rainbow tables. Collisions, if you remember, we talked about collisions when we introduced hashing functions. We said that a collision is a situation where two different inputs create the same resulting output of a hash function. That's bad. Such a collision is bad because it defeats the concept behind integrity, which means that there are potential situations where an attacker can maliciously change a file or the contents of a network traffic in such a way so that the resulting hash applied to the new set of data is the same. That's one way of exploiting such a collision. So the attacker managed to alter the changes, but also found a way in which those changes don't change the actual resulting hash. Think about how important this is for digitally signed documents. We trust a digitally signed document that it hasn't been tampered with, and that's the original document that we're looking at. Well, what if the attacker manages to add some content to that original document and still maintain the same digital signature? And even though this sounds terribly theoretical, let's say, it's sometimes connected to something called the birthday paradox. And the birthday paradox is a simple question that says, how many people do you think need to be in a group so that the chance of two of them sharing the same birthday is 50%? Just think about it for a second. How many people do you need in a group so that there's a 50% chance of two of them sharing a birthday? Now, many people would say something along the lines like 180, like the half the days in a year or something like that. The actual answer is as low as 23. And the reason people think about this problem in a wrong manner, in a wrong approach, is the fact that while the chances of two people having an exact same birthday, a specific same birthday, are low, well, the chances of two people having any identical birthday are much higher. So we only need 23 people in a group to have a 50% chance of two of them sharing a birthday. And what's even more spectacular is that if you go up to 60 people, you're already up to 99% probability. So this is connected to the act of exploiting collisions, because it's actually not that difficult to generate different inputs that could generate the same output in a hashing function. And that's why most hashing algorithms, or the security of the hashing algorithms, is measured, or, well, quote unquote measured, in how resistant they are against collision attacks, or how difficult it is to determine different inputs that provide the same output. Now, finally, some thoughts about what's next. What's next in this field of cryptography? Now, you probably heard about quantum computing and quantum cryptography. Well, quantum computers base their calculations or store their data not with bits, because a bit can only have a value of 0 or 1, but with qubits, quantum bits, which can either store 0 or 1, but they can also store with a certain probability any value in between 0 and 1. And that exact state that cannot be determined is called a superposition. You might think, okay, so we have just more values. No, the actual benefits of quantum computing is that these qubits can be entangled. That is, they can be connected to one another. So when one qubit is being collapsed to either 0 or 1, all the other entangled qubits also collapse in turn, which is a process that consumes much less computing power than normal CPU-based operations that normally change CPU registers and perform mathematical operations and such. So you can have a huge number of states, of variables, of values in memory, all changing at the same time, all connected to the same operation, which provides us a lot more computing power, both for generating encryption material and for cracking or for breaking encrypted data. And there's one thing that should be mentioned here. Regardless of how strong the encryption algorithm or hashing algorithms they are, at some point they are all vulnerable to brute force attacks. I mean, regardless of how long of a key you're using, regardless of how complex the actual encryption algorithm is, if you have the necessary computational power of trying each and every possible key that can be used with that algorithm, at some point in theory, you will be able to crack that encrypted data. Now, what we're relying on nowadays is the fact that the algorithms and the key lengths that we're currently using make this computational operation impossible, or make it take so long that it becomes irrelevant. Now, here's a nice website that you can play with just to understand the complexity of breaking a secure key or a password. So let's add a password right here. Let's say the password is 1234. That's it. All right, we can see how that password is being characterized. And in an online attack, let's say that you can try 1000 attempts per second in an authentication system. You could break it in 11 seconds. Now, in an offline fast attack, so this is one of the situations where you gained access, let's say, to the hash database, and you're attempting to generate all the possible combinations in an attempt to break this password. It might take you like what is that? All right, less than 1 second. Okay, let's add some more complexity in here. 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C. Well, we're up to almost 1 second here for an offline attack. Definitely more difficult. Now let's add some punctuation in here. For example, let's change this to capital A and add an exclamation mark at the end. There you go. We're up to 2000 centuries for an online attack and 18 hours in an offline attack. Let's try a passphrase. That is something such as, hello world and everyone. Let's see how long would this take to be cracked by an online or an offline attack. So you can see right here, if we're going up in the key length and key complexity, actually we just went up in key length. I mean, how much complexity we have in here? It's just alphabet letters, lowercase, and some spaces, and that's it. It's not much of a complex password, but look how tough it is to crack this type of password, even in an offline attack, or even with using a massive cracking array. It's not even worth to try, right? This is what we're based on right now. Now, if at some point somebody invents a CPU that is 10 trillion times faster than anything we have right now, well, we're going to have some problems with our current encryption algorithms and our current key lengths, and we might not be so trustworthy now with online shopping as we were before. There's a lot of research being performed that allows low-power devices, especially IoT devices and small sensors, to implement advanced cryptography functions. There's a lot of research here because they are extremely limited in processing power and in the instructions that they know how to execute. Homomorphic encryption is an interesting one, especially related to processing personally identifiable information or any type of sensitive data. It's a way to allow the processing, at least the statistical processing of protected data, which might be in some sort of an encrypted form, without actually having access to the data itself. So you are able to perform, let's say, statistical evaluations on a data set, but you're not able to view the individual data points in that data set, which is great for collecting personal information and generating statistics and reports, but without actually having access to that personal information. And everybody knows about blockchain, right? It's just a list of transactions that is distributed all over the world. Now, each record in that list of transactions is called a block, and it is mathematically connected using hashing algorithms to the blocks before it. So anybody in the world can validate that a certain block belongs in a blockchain, that the transaction has been validated, and all this distributed database acts like a public ledger that everybody has access to. So it's completely decentralized. You can use blockchain for, as you probably know, for cryptocurrency, for recording transaction, for recording consent, for recording notary operations, for a lot of stuff. Basically, on every situation where you need to record a piece of information and be able to allow everyone to validate that the record hasn't been tampered with, hasn't been forged. And finally, we also have steganography. It's not exactly related to the future, but it's a connected cryptographic concept. Steganography basically means secret writing. It's a way to hide information in plain sight. You can hide information in the white spaces of a document. How many white spaces you're using after each word. How many, let's say you can hide information inside the color data of a picture, as in just shifting the color codes on each pixel just by a value of 1, and then being able to reverse this process allows you to hide information in a place where somebody else would not even guess that the information is hidden. Now, this is not exactly cryptography, this is more like security through obscurity, but it's a very smart method of exfiltrating data out of a company, for example. If you know that the company DLP solution or filters or firewalls aren't going to allow you to send files, to create a VPN connection to the outside, but you are allowed, for example, to send pictures because perhaps your email signature contains a picture or company logo, well, you could hide confidential information or confidential documents inside those pictures, inside that company logo, and send it outside of the company without somebody even noticing. We could also use steganography to hide information in network protocols. How about sending ping messages in Morse code to communicate something, right? Who expects that? Or how about hiding information in TCP flags or in DNS requests? Because nobody looks at those, right? Whatever is in a DNS request, apart from the actual URL that you're interrogating, is probably legitimate information. What about the frequency that you're sending those requests with? There's a lot of methods here to exfiltrate data and to hide it in plain sight. Right, just for a minute now, let me just show you how steganography actually works. I'm going to use for this the small utility called StegoSuite, which is a free utility that you can download from the default repositories in Kali. All right, so I'm just going to load a picture. Go to File, Open. I have a beach sunset, nice picture in here. Let's open this one. That's the picture, right? I can now embed either a secret message or a file within this picture without changing visibly anything regarding to that picture. So it's going to look exactly the same. So let's say that the secret message right here is password is 12345. That's the information I want to hide within this picture. I'm going to click on embed. Wait for a couple of seconds here. Tells me that embedding completed, saved to blah, 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 beach sunset embed JPEG. So let's move over to that location, which is right here in the downloads folder. Let's open up this file. And this is the original JPEG file. And this is the JPEG file with the embedded hidden information. I'm going to switch back and forth between them. And I am completely unable to see any difference between these two files. All right. Now let's go back here to Stego Suite. Let's open up another file. This time let's open the embedded file that we just created. Notice that it is slightly larger in size, right? Just a few kilobytes in size. Let's open this one up and then click on extract. By the way, you can also protect this information with a password. So you can basically encrypt the data that you're hiding within that image file. But since I did not use a password when I first embedded it, I can just click on extract. And there you have it, extracting complete, and the text now is, again, password is 12345. So hidden information, hidden in plain sight, so you can simply attach this JPEG file to an email message, send it over instant message, and send it however you want it, however you are allowed to send files from your company, and you can exfiltrate information this way. So those are the major cryptography use cases for you. I don't think anyone would have expected cryptography to be a simple topic. So I know this has been a lot of information, a lot of topics we covered here, but try to make sure that all this makes sense in your mind. So thank you so much for watching. If you want to discuss more about the topics that we covered here, leave a comment in the comment section. If you like this, of course, like and subscribe on YouTube. Good luck on the exam, good luck on your studies, and see you on the next video. Bye bye.